I didn't realize I was losing pieces of myself at first. It happened so quietly that I thought it was normal, like dust settling on furniture you stop noticing after a while. My husband's mother had this way of smiling while taking something from you, making it feel rude to even question it. She never grabbed. She never demanded. She offered. And I accepted again and again, because I wanted peace, because I wanted to belong, because I thought love meant compromise. The first thing she took wasn't physical. It was my confidence. She questioned everything I did in that soft, concerned voice. Are you sure that's how it's done? Maybe you misunderstood. You're very sensitive, you know. Each sentence landed gently, but they stacked up inside me until I started doubting my own memory, my own judgment. I began replaying conversations in my head late at night, wondering if I really had said the wrong thing, if I really was the problem. When we moved into her house, she framed it like a rescue. You'll save money. You'll be less stressed. You'll have family around you. I ignored the tight feeling in my chest because everyone else said I was lucky. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself strong women don't complain about small discomforts. So I swallowed my unease and smiled when she rearranged my belongings, explaining that her way was better, more efficient, more proper. Then she started managing things for me. Not because I asked, but because she insisted. She kept track of bills so I wouldn't overwhelm myself. She suggested I stop working for a while to focus on the marriage. She said I looked tired, said stress wasn't good for a woman trying to build a family. My husband nodded along, grateful someone else was taking responsibility. I felt myself shrinking, but I didn't know how to say no without sounding ungrateful. She took my documents under the excuse of safety. Important papers get lost, she said. Fires happen. You're young, you don't think ahead. I watched her slide my life into a folder and place it in her cupboard, and I told myself it didn't matter. We live together, I thought. What's the difference? But that cupboard might as well have been a locked door inside my chest. Something irreversible shifted in that moment, even if I didn't have words for it yet. Money was next. It wasn't dramatic. My card declined once and she laughed it off. Probably the bank, she said. Later she told me she'd moved things around to protect me. You don't need access to all of it, she explained patiently. It's safer this way. I remember nodding while my stomach twisted, feeling childish for wanting control over something that was supposed to be shared. I started asking for cash like a child asking for allowance, hating myself a little more each time. What hurt the most was how invisible it all was to everyone else. To outsiders, she was generous, supportive, involved. To my husband, she was helping us survive. Every time I tried to explain how trapped I felt, the words came out wrong. It sounded petty. It sounded exaggerated. And so I stopped trying. Silence felt safer than being dismissed. I began measuring my movements. How long I stayed in the shower. How often I used my phone. Whether my tone sounded respectful enough. I caught myself rehearsing conversations before they happened, editing myself to avoid her disappointment. I was constantly aware of her presence, even when she wasn't in the room. Her approval became something I chased without realizing it, like oxygen I didn't know I was holding my breath for. She never raised her voice. That was her power. Everything was calm, controlled, reasonable. If I cried, she looked concerned and told me I was overreacting. If I protested, she reminded me of everything she'd done for me. You're family now, she'd say. Families make sacrifices. And every time, guilt stitched my mouth shut. I started losing touch with people outside that house. Calls went unanswered because I didn't have privacy. Messages stayed unread because she always seemed to be nearby. Slowly, my world narrowed until it was just those walls, her rules, her expectations. I told myself it was adulthood, that this was what marriage looked like. But deep down, something kept whispering that this wasn't normal, that love wasn't supposed to feel like erasure. The control wasn't loud. That's what makes it terrifying. It crept in under the disguise of care, wrapped itself around my life, and tightened without warning. By the time I realized how much she had taken, I no longer knew how to ask for it back. I stood in that house every day, smiling, obedient, compliant, while inside I was screaming, wondering how someone could take everything from you without ever touching you at all. The silence inside my marriage was louder than anything she ever said. Once we moved into her house, my husband changed in ways I didn't recognize at first. He stopped asking how I was, stopped noticing when I went quiet. Conversations between us became practical, transactional, like we were roommates sharing a space instead of two people who once promised to protect each other. And every time I reached for him, emotionally or physically, there was this invisible wall I couldn't get past. At night, when the house finally slept, I would turn toward him and wait. Sometimes I waited for hours, hoping he'd say something first. Anything. An apology. A question. Even frustration would have been better than the emptiness. But he would scroll on his phone or close his eyes, pretending to be exhausted. The space between us felt deliberate, like he was choosing distance over discomfort. I started to wonder if I was imagining it, if marriage was just supposed to feel lonely after a while. I tried to talk to him at first. Carefully, softly, I told him I felt watched, that his mother made decisions about my life without asking me. He'd sigh and say she meant well. He'd remind me that we depended on her right now, that it wasn't the time to create conflict. Just adjust for now, he said. Just be patient. His words always ended the same way: once things settle, it will be better. But things never settled, they only tightened. Every time he sided with her, something inside me fractured. Not all at once, but in small, painful cracks. When she corrected me and he stayed silent. When she dismissed my opinion, and he changed the subject. When she joked about me being emotional, and he laughed along. Those moments replayed in my head long after they passed, growing heavier each time, until I carried them with me everywhere. I began censoring myself around him. If I spoke honestly, it led to arguments that ended with him walking away. If I stayed quiet, the peace felt fake, but at least it lasted. I learned which topics made him uncomfortable and avoided them. I learned which expressions annoyed him, and trained my face accordingly. I hated that I was adapting to survive in my own marriage, but I didn't know another way. The isolation was subtle but complete. His family became our entire social circle. My friends slowly disappeared from my life, not because I didn't care, but because maintaining those connections required energy and privacy I no longer had. Phone calls felt risky. Texts felt monitored. Even my thoughts felt unsafe sometimes, like they could be exposed if I wasn't careful enough. I felt alone even when the house was full. What hurt most was realizing he saw my isolation and accepted it. He knew I had no one nearby. He knew I depended on him to understand what was happening inside that house. And still, he chose comfort over confrontation. I watched him become smaller too, folding into the role his mother had prepared for him, letting her speak for us, decide for us, plan our lives. In a strange way, we were both trapped, but only one of us had the option to pretend everything was fine. I started questioning my worth. If my own husband wouldn't defend me, what did that say about me? I replayed our early days together, searching for signs I had missed. I wondered if I had changed, if I had somehow become unlovable, difficult, expendable. The house felt colder as those thoughts took root. Even my reflection began to look unfamiliar, like I was watching someone fade. There were moments when I almost broke. When I sat on the bathroom floor with the door locked, trying not to make a sound as tears soaked into my sleeves. When I stared at my phone, wanting to call someone, anyone, but realizing I didn't know what to say without sounding dramatic or weak. When I imagined packing a bag and leaving, then remembered I had nowhere to go, nothing that was fully mine. His mother's control worked because my marriage made room for it. That realization came slowly and painfully. The isolation wasn't just imposed on me, it was allowed. Each time my husband chose silence, he reinforced her power. Each time he dismissed my fear, he made it feel less real. I stopped expecting him to protect me. That expectation hurt too much to carry. Eventually, the house stopped feeling like a shared space and started feeling like enemy territory. I moved through it cautiously, like someone trespassing. My marriage existed only in name. There was no partnership, no safety, no refuge. Just routines and quiet tension, and a growing sense that I had been left behind, alone inside a life that was supposed to be ours. Survival became my only focus once I accepted that no one was coming to save me. That realization didn't arrive dramatically. It settled in slowly, like a heavy coat I couldn't take off. I woke up each morning already tired, already calculating how to get through the day without drawing attention, without causing offense, without losing more than I already had. I stopped thinking about happiness. I started thinking in terms of endurance. I learned the rhythms of the house, the way someone learns a dangerous landscape. I knew when she woke up, when she rested, when her mood was light, and when it was sharp. I timed my movements around her presence. I chose my words carefully, measuring every sentence before letting it leave my mouth. Even silence had rules. Too quiet meant sulking. Too cheerful meant suspicious. I aimed for invisible. Food became another place where control lived. She decided what we ate, when we ate, how much was appropriate. If I cooked, she corrected me. If I didn't, she commented on my laziness. I ate less without meaning to, my appetite shrinking alongside my sense of self. Hunger felt safer than criticism. At least hunger was something I could control. Sleep was shallow. I kept one ear open at night, alert to footsteps in the hallway, to doors opening, to whispers that might include my name. My dreams were crowded with half-finished arguments and locked rooms. I woke up tense, jaw clenched, shoulders tight, already bracing for the day ahead. My body understood the danger, even when my mind tried to normalize it. I found small, almost pathetic ways to cope. I memorized phone numbers in case my phone was taken. I hid a little cash inside a folded sock at the back of my drawer, adding to it whenever I could, even if it was just a few coins. I kept mental notes of conversations, of statements she made, of promises that contradicted each other. I didn't know why I was collecting these things. I just knew I needed proof of something, even if I wasn't sure what yet. There were moments of panic that came out of nowhere. My chest would tighten while I was washing dishes or folding laundry, my breath turning shallow as a single thought looped in my head: what if this never ends? I learned how to breathe through it without anyone noticing. I pressed my fingernails into my palm, counted silently, reminded myself that breaking down would only give her more control. I became skilled at appearing calm. On the outside, I was obedient, agreeable, helpful. On the inside, I was constantly alert. Every interaction felt like a test I couldn't afford to fail. I laughed at jokes that hurt. I apologized for things I hadn't done. I thanked her for decisions that erased me. Survival meant swallowing my pride until it burned. The hardest part was pretending I didn't notice what was happening. Acknowledging the truth, even privately, felt dangerous. If I admitted I was being controlled, then I also had to admit how trapped I was. So I focused on logistics instead of emotions. What do I need today? How do I avoid conflict? How do I make it to tonight without incident? I reduced my life to manageable steps. I stopped dreaming. Not consciously, but completely. The future became a blank space I didn't look at for too long. Thinking ahead made me dizzy. Hope felt reckless. I lived in the present moment, but not in a peaceful way. More like an animal staying still so it wouldn't be noticed. Every day survived felt like a small victory, even though it cost me something each time. I watched myself change and didn't recognize the person I was becoming. I used to speak freely, laugh loudly, take up space without apology. Now I moved quietly, carefully, like my existence needed permission. That awareness hurt, but it also hardened me. Somewhere beneath the fear, a quiet determination started to grow. Not rebellion, not escape, just the refusal to completely disappear. Survival stripped me down to something raw and basic. Eat when you can. Rest when it's safe. Observe everything. Remember who you were, even if only in fragments. I didn't know how or when things would change. I didn't have a plan that led out. But I held on to one thought like a lifeline. As long as I'm aware, as long as I'm watching, I'm still here. And being here, even in that reduced, silent way, was an act of resistance all on its own. The realization didn't strike like lightning. It crept in slowly, quietly, almost gently, and that's what made it terrifying. One moment I was washing dishes, watching her reflection move behind me in the glass cabinet, and the next I felt this sudden, hollow clarity settle in my chest. She wasn't reacting to me anymore. She was predicting me, anticipating my choices before I made them, adjusting the environment around me, so I never even reached the point of resistance. That's when I understood. This wasn't control born from chaos or emotion. This was planned. I started replaying everything from the beginning, but this time without the excuses I'd wrapped around it. Her kindness had always come with timing. Her generosity always appeared right before something was taken away. Every favor created a debt. Every smile carried an expectation. I saw now how carefully she had positioned herself as the center of our lives, how she'd made herself indispensable while quietly making me dependent. None of it was accidental. None of it was about love. I noticed how often she spoke for me, especially in front of others. She'd answer questions directed at me. She'd explain my feelings before I could. She'd rewrite my intentions with a laugh. And people believed her. That was the part that made my stomach drop. She wasn't just controlling me inside the house. She was shaping the version of me that existed outside it. I was being edited out of my own life, sentence by sentence. Once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. Every interaction took on a new weight. When she asked where I was going, it wasn't curiosity. It was surveillance. When she offered advice, it wasn't concern. It was correction. When she praised me, it was conditional, fragile, easily withdrawn. My compliance wasn't appreciated. It was expected. And the moment I hesitated, even slightly, the atmosphere shifted. The air thickened. Silence sharpened. I realized she had learned exactly how much pressure to apply without leaving marks. She knew how to make me doubt myself without ever raising her voice. She knew how to isolate me while appearing generous. And she knew my husband would never challenge her because she had trained him long before I arrived. I wasn't fighting one person. I was standing inside a system that had been built to absorb me. The most painful realization was understanding my role in it. Not because I wanted it, but because I had been chosen for it. She saw my patience, my desire for harmony, my habit of giving the benefit of the doubt. And she used it. I wasn't weak, but I was trusting. And in that house, trust was a liability. I had walked in believing love meant endurance, and she had turned that belief into a leash. I began noticing how often she reminded me of my position. Subtle comments about where I came from, comparisons to women who were more practical or less emotional, stories about other daughters. in-law who failed because they didn't know their place. But each remark landed softly, but together they formed a narrative where I was always one mistake away from being replaceable. Fear kept me quiet. Gratitude kept me compliant. There was a moment, standing alone in the mirror, when I barely recognized myself. My eyes looked older, watchful, like someone waiting for permission to exist, and instead of feeling panic, I felt something colder and clearer. Understanding. This wasn't about misunderstandings or generational differences or cultural expectations. This was about power. She needed to feel important, necessary, unchallenged. And controlling me was how she fed that need. That realization didn't free me instantly. It didn't give me courage or strength or an escape route. But it did something just as important. It returned my reality to me. I stopped blaming myself for feeling trapped. I stopped trying to fix something that was never broken in the first place. The problem wasn't my sensitivity, or my communication, or my patience. The problem was that someone had decided my life was theirs to manage. From that point on, I watched differently. Not like a victim trying to survive, but like someone gathering truth. I noticed patterns. I noticed timing. I noticed how she reacted when information was withheld, when plans changed without her input, when I didn't immediately respond. Her calm cracked in those moments, just enough for me to see what lived underneath it. Control wasn't her preference. It was her fear. That understanding shifted something deep inside me. I was still trapped physically, still dependent, still quiet on the surface. But internally, the fog lifted. I knew what this was now. And knowing didn't make me reckless. It made me patient. Because once you understand the rules of a game you didn't choose, you stop blaming yourself for losing. And you start watching for the moment when the game can no longer be played the same way. The exposure didn't happen the way I imagined it would. There was no dramatic confrontation, no raised voices, no moment where I finally shouted everything I'd been holding inside. It unfolded slowly, almost quietly, like a seam coming apart after being stretched too far. By the time she realized what was happening, the truth had already slipped beyond her control. It started with small disruptions. I stopped volunteering information. I answered questions directly, without explanations, without apologies. When she asked where I was going, I gave a simple answer and nothing more. When she offered advice, I thanked her and did what I had already decided to do. These changes were subtle, but she noticed. I could see it in the way her eyes lingered on me, calculating, unsettled by the shift she couldn't name. She tested me, asked the same questions in different ways, created situations where I was expected to comply automatically. And when I didn't respond the way she anticipated, the mask slipped just enough for others to notice. A sharp tone here, a passive remark there. People who had always seen her as composed began exchanging glances. I didn't point anything out. I didn't need to. All I had to do was stop absorbing the impact. The first real crack appeared during a family gathering. Someone asked me a question directly. Something ordinary, harmless. Before I could answer, she stepped in, speaking for me as usual. But this time I gently interrupted, just one sentence. Calm, clear. The room went quiet. Not because I was loud, but because I wasn't supposed to do that. Her smile froze. The silence stretched long enough for everyone to feel it. After that, things escalated. She confronted me privately, her voice still controlled but tighter now. She reminded me of everything she'd done for me. She listed sacrifices, favors, support. The old guilt tried to rise, but it didn't land the same way anymore. I listened without defending myself, without collapsing. When she finished, I simply said I appreciated her help, but I would be handling things myself going forward. Her eyes hardened. Control was slipping, and she felt it. Words spread without me saying a word. My change in behavior created questions. Why was she suddenly quieter in conversations? Why wasn't she making decisions for me anymore? Why did she seem irritated when I spoke? The narrative she had built around me, fragile, dependent, emotional, no longer matched what people were seeing. That mismatch exposed the manipulation more effectively than any accusation ever could. The pressure increased. She tried to reassert authority through my husband, through relatives, through subtle social consequences. Coldness, exclusion, strategic silence. But each attempt only revealed how much influence she had been exerting all along. People started noticing patterns, noticing who was uncomfortable when I spoke, noticing how often my voice had been replaced by hers. The moment that changed everything came unexpectedly. A misunderstanding over something trivial turned into a public contradiction. She corrected me sharply in front of others, expecting me to retreat. Instead, I calmly stated the truth, backed by facts she hadn't anticipated I'd have. The room shifted. Her composure fractured completely this time. She raised her voice. Just slightly. Enough. That was all it took. Once the illusion cracked, it couldn't be repaired. People began revisiting old interactions with new eyes. Comments that once seemed harmless now sounded controlling. Jokes now felt pointed. Her constant involvement now felt invasive. I watched the story unravel without touching it. The truth didn't need embellishment. It only needed space. She accused me of changing, of being ungrateful, of turning people against her. I didn't deny it. I didn't argue. I simply stopped protecting her image. That was the real exposure. Not what I said, but what I refused to hide anymore. Her behavior, stripped of my silence, stood naked and undeniable. For the first time, I saw fear in her eyes. Not fear of losing me, but fear of losing control. Fear of being seen without the mask she had worn so carefully. She tried to regain footing, to rewrite the narrative, but it was too late. Once people witness control instead of care, they don't forget it. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady, grounded in reality. The truth had surfaced, not through drama, but through consistency, through quiet resistance, through my refusal to disappear anymore. And as her authority weakened, the consequences began lining up, waiting for the final moment when everything she had built on silence would finally collapse under the weight of being seen. The consequences came slowly, like the tide pulling away sand, revealing everything that had been buried. At first, it was subtle, almost imperceptible. The way she looked at me had changed, no longer the calm, knowing smile, but something sharp, jittery, cautious. Every step she took around the house seemed measured, every word calculated. I could feel her recalibrating, as if the world she had built to contain me had suddenly become unstable. It began with my husband. The tension that had existed between us finally found a voice. He started questioning things he had once accepted blindly. Small things at first, like why decisions had been made without him, or why I seemed so quiet. And as he began to speak, the veil between us lifted just a little. We didn't have long, easy conversations yet, but we had recognition. We were on the same side, even if only slowly, even if only quietly. That was enough to shift the balance. Her control began to crumble in practical ways too. Documents I had thought lost or locked away began reappearing. Money I had assumed was inaccessible became mine again. It wasn't dramatic. There were no shouting matches or overt confrontations. It was more like watching a house of cards lean too far. A structure that had relied on my silence finally faltering. The very things she had used to trap me were now, ironically, the tools of her unraveling. People outside the household started noticing things too. Friends, extended family, even neighbors who had always seen her as sweet, nurturing, perfect, began to sense the tension, the control, the unease that lingered behind her facade. Small comments slipped. Stories came out, details that no one outside the house should have known. And with each revelation, her reputation cracked. Authority, once assumed, doesn't survive scrutiny well, and hers was built entirely on the illusion of compliance and perfection. The first moment I really felt the weight of it all was when she realized that my father had been involved. That realization hit her like a blow. She had assumed that every move she made, every manipulation, every small act of control, was invisible, unchallengeable. She never considered that someone with influence, knowledge, and resources, someone who cared about me in ways she couldn't, was quietly observing, quietly preparing. The fear in her eyes at that moment is something I'll never forget. It wasn't anger or frustration. It was sheer, unmitigated panic. My father arrived like a force she had never anticipated. He didn't yell, he didn't make threats, but he brought with him evidence, documentation, and the kind of authority that cannot be negotiated with. Contracts, bank statements, letters, things she thought were hidden, things she had manipulated, were suddenly tangible, undeniable. I watched as her calm veneer crumbled, as the quiet dominance she had exercised for so long collapsed under scrutiny. What struck me most was how quickly her tactics failed once the truth was in the open. Lies she had spun, favors she had twisted, control she had asserted, they all relied on my silence. Once I stopped hiding and someone with power intervened, her entire strategy became fragile. Every step she had taken to dominate me was now exposed as manipulation. And that exposure rippled outward, affecting not just her, but the way my husband, the household, and even extended family perceived her. The shift in my husband was immediate and profound. He began questioning the narratives she had built around him, around us. He started apologizing for inaction, for silence, for complicity. He began supporting me openly, defending my choices, reinforcing my voice. I could feel the marriage, the partnership I had thought lost, slowly returning. Fragile but real. It was one of the first times in months that I felt seen, protected, understood, not because I demanded it, but because circumstances had finally forced recognition. She tried to resist at first, of course. She used guilt, subtle intimidation, reminders of everything she had done for us, threats veiled in kindness. But these tactics had no purchase anymore. People were watching. I was no longer silent. My father's presence, my husband's awakening, the scrutiny of others. It was a tide that could not be turned back. Every attempt at control now only highlighted her previous manipulation. She had lost before she even realized the fight had begun. I felt a strange mix of relief, vindication, and caution. The house was no longer a place of fear, but the tension lingered. The consequences weren't just hers. They were ours too. We had to navigate the aftermath carefully. Relationships had been strained, trust fractured, and years of manipulation had left scars. But even in that, there was hope. Hope that honesty, transparency, and courage could rebuild what had been damaged. That survival wasn't just about endurance. It was about reclaiming what had been taken. The final realization of consequences came quietly one evening. I was sitting at the kitchen table, documents spread in front of me, my father talking softly to my husband about finances and plans, and I looked at her. She was silent, her usual energy gone. She didn't argue, didn't smile, didn't correct. She just existed in the quiet, and I saw everything she had lost. Not just control over me, but over the narrative, over perception, over power itself. She was diminished not because of anger or revenge, but because truth had a way of rendering manipulation impotent. And in that moment, I understood something I hadn't fully realized before. The consequences weren't just external. They were internal too. I felt freer, stronger, more solid than I had in months. I didn't need to speak loudly, I didn't need to assert with force. The quiet, measured exposure, the patient unveiling of truth, had done what fear and obedience never could. It had restored my life. It had restored me. I walked through the house after that, noticing small things I hadn't before. The way sunlight fell across the living room, the sounds of the neighborhood outside, the empty spaces in my own home that were finally mine again. Every step reminded me of the cost of silence, but also the power of action. Every breath reminded me that consequences are inevitable when control is misused, but that they can also be liberating when truth is finally acknowledged. By the time the dust settled, I realized the balance had shifted permanently. Her dominance was gone. My husband and I had reclaimed our life, step by step. The house felt different, not perfect, not magically healed, but ours. And for the first time in a long while, I breathed without hesitation. The consequences she had once feared, loss of respect, exposure, the dismantling of authority, had arrived, and with them came freedom I didn't dare hope for in those dark, early months. I understood finally that consequences are not always violent or dramatic. They can be quiet. They can be subtle. They can come in the form of reality catching up to manipulation, of truth asserting itself patiently, of people who were previously complicit awakening. And sometimes, consequences don't just punish, they restore. They give back what was taken, not in pieces, but in a completeness you almost forgot existed. Walking forward after that, I carried lessons in my chest, scars on my heart, and clarity in my mind. I had survived fear, isolation, control, manipulation. I had witnessed the exposure that could not be ignored, and I had lived through the consequences that finally brought justice. Not as revenge, but as the inevitable result of truth standing firm. It was quiet, it was deliberate, and it was life, changing in ways that nothing else could have been. From that moment on, I knew something essential about power, control, and resilience. Nothing built on fear, silence, or deception can last forever, and nothing that belongs to you, your voice, your independence, your life, can truly be taken as long as you hold even a small spark of awareness. The consequences had arrived, they were thorough, and they had restored me.